The late afternoon sun painted the neighborhood in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the pristine lawns and quiet streets. A group of kids laughed as they played basketball in the driveway of a modest, well-kept home at the end of the cul-de-sac. Their laughter echoed in the crisp air, blending with the distant hum of a lawnmower and the soft chirping of birds. They were just kids, oblivious to the world's judgments, enjoying the simplicity of a game. Across the street, however, the mood was anything but cheerful. A curtain twitched in one of the large bay windows of the colonial-style house that stood opposite. Inside, a woman in her late 50s peered out, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Margaret Peterson had lived in the neighborhood for over 2 decades, and she prided herself on keeping it safe and orderly. To her, the sight of those kids, their skin tones a stark contrast to her own, was an affront. She muttered under her breath, her irritation building with every bounce of the ball. Margaret grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed 911. Her voice, laced with false concern, carried a tone she had perfected over the years. "Yes, hi. I'd like to report some suspicious activity. There's a group of teenagers outside. They're being loud and disruptive, and I'm not sure they belong here." She paused, glancing out the window again. "Yes, this is in the Willow Creek neighborhood. Please send someone quickly." Meanwhile, outside, the kids were oblivious to Margaret's scrutiny. Jimmel, the oldest at 15, was showing his younger siblings how to perfect a layup. His sister Mia, only 10 but fiercely competitive, tried to steal the ball from her older brother, laughing as she failed. Their youngest brother, Marcus, just 7, clapped and cheered them on from the sidelines, his sneakers too big for his tiny feet. They had no idea that their innocent game was about to take a turn. Minutes later, the faint sound of sirens pierced the air. The kids froze, their laughter fading as they exchanged confused glances. Jimmel's heart sank as he saw the flashing blue lights approach. He instinctively stepped in front of Mia and Marcus, his protective instincts kicking in. The squad car rolled to a stop, and a uniformed officer stepped out, his expression unreadable. Margaret watched from her window, a smirk of satisfaction playing on her lips. She folded her arms, confident she had done the right thing. But what she didn't know was that this time, things were different. This wasn't going to play out the way she expected. The officer approached the kids, his hand resting lightly on his belt. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Jamal nodded quickly, his voice steady despite the nervous knot in his stomach. "Yes, sir. We're just playing basketball. This is our house." Before the officer could respond, another car pulled up, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. The door swung open, and out stepped a tall man in a sharp suit. His presence commanded immediate attention. The kids' faces lit up, recognizing their father instantly. But the officer's expression shifted from professional to uneasy as he realized who he was looking at. The man walked toward the group with an air of quiet authority, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his deep voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge. The officer straightened, his demeanor shifting to one of respect. "No, Chief," the officer stammered. "Just responding to a call about some suspicious activity." The man's sharp eyes flicked toward the house across the street, where Margaret now stood frozen behind her window, her smug confidence evaporating. He turned back to the officer. "These are my kids," he said simply, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The officer nodded quickly, an apology forming on his lips, but the chief wasn't finished. He crouched down to Jamal's level, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "You did nothing wrong," he said firmly. Then, straightening up, he turned back to the officer. "I'll handle this." Margaret, still hidden behind her curtain, felt a chill run down her spine as the chief's gaze shifted toward her house. For the first time, she realized she might have made a mistake. Margaret's heart raced as she watched the tall man, now clearly identified as the new police chief, linger on her house. She quickly stepped back from the window, her mind scrambling for excuses. For years, she had maintained her self-appointed role as the neighborhood watchdog, but something about this situation was different. She had heard rumors about the new family at the end of the cul-de-sac, but now those rumors were staring her in the face, and they carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. The chief stood there for a moment longer, his posture calm but deliberate, then turned back to his kids. "Why don't you all head inside?" he said, his voice softening. Jamal hesitated, his eyes searching his father's face. "It's okay," the chief assured him with a small nod. "I'll take care of this." The kids shuffled toward the house, Jamal keeping an arm protectively around his younger siblings. As they disappeared through the front door, the chief's expression hardened. He walked back toward the officer, who was still standing stiffly by his patrol car. "Who called this in?" the chief asked, his voice quiet but commanding. The officer glanced at the house across the street, then back at his superior. "A neighbor," he said quickly. "She reported suspicious activity, but it seems like a misunderstanding. I didn't mean." The chief held up a hand, cutting him off. "Next time, you might want to verify the situation before pulling up with lights and sirens. These are children playing in their own yard. Do better." The officer nodded, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Understood, Chief," he muttered before retreating to his car. Within seconds, the patrol car was gone, its lights fading into the distance. The chief turned back toward Margaret's house, his jaw tightening. He didn't need to see her to know she was watching. People like her were familiar to him, quick to judge, slow to understand, and always hiding behind their curtains when confronted. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. This wasn't the time to act out of anger. No, he had a different plan. Inside the house, the kids huddled in the living room, their earlier joy replaced by unease. Jamal sat on the couch, his arms still around Mia, while Marcus clung to his sister's hand. Their mother, a warm and steady presence, knelt in front of them, her eyes full of concern. "What happened out there?" she asked softly, brushing a stray curl out of Mia's face. Jamal shook his head. "Someone called the cops on us," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "We weren't doing anything wrong, Mom. We were just playing." "I know, baby," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You didn't do anything wrong." She glanced toward the door, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Your father will handle it." Back outside, the chief finally turned and walked toward his own house, his steps measured and deliberate. Margaret, still hiding behind her curtain, exhaled a shaky breath. She had expected a quick resolution, a simple validation of her complaint. Instead, she found herself grappling with a growing sense of dread. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to justify her actions. Asteriski was just being cautious, she told herself. Canyon would have done the same, but deep down, she knew that wasn't entirely true. She had seen those kids before, laughing and playing like any other children. She had no real reason to be suspicious, only her own prejudices, though she would never admit that, even to herself. As the evening wore on, the neighborhood slowly returned to its usual quiet rhythm. The kids went to bed, though Jamal stayed awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling as his mind replayed the events of the afternoon. In the master bedroom, the chief sat at the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. His wife sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. He nodded, though his expression betrayed his frustration. "I expected pushback," he said, his voice low. "But not this soon, not like this." "You're handling it," she said firmly, "and you're setting an example for the kids. That's what matters." He looked up at her, his eyes softening. "I just hate that they have to deal with this," he admitted. "They should be able to play outside without being treated like criminals." "They have you," she reminded him. And that makes all the difference. The next morning, the neighborhood seemed almost too quiet, as if holding its breath. Margaret avoided going outside, keeping her blinds drawn as she busied herself with household chores. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the events of the previous day. She couldn't shake the image of the police chief standing in front of her house, his eyes piercing and unyielding. Meanwhile, at the end of the cul-de-sac, the chief was already up and moving. He made breakfast for his kids, cracking jokes to lighten the mood, though the tension from the day before still lingered in the air. Afterward, he headed to his home office, where a stack of paperwork awaited him. But before he could dive in, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from a fellow officer, a friend from his previous precinct. "Hey, heard about what happened yesterday. Everything okay?" The message read. "It might," she said softly. "And if it doesn't, at least you'll know you tried. You always said it's better to confront ignorance head-on." He sighed, his fingers drumming against the table. She was right, as usual. But he wasn't sure if Margaret Peterson was the type to change her mind, no matter how much reasoning or kindness he offered. Still, ignoring the situation didn't feel right either. At the same time, Margaret's husband, Tom, was grappling with his own thoughts. He had always been a quiet man, content to stay out of his wife's business. But this time, he couldn't shake the feeling that she had gone too far. Sitting in his recliner with the morning paper, he glanced at her as she fussed with a potted plant on the porch. The expression on her face, a mixture of defiance and unease, told him everything he needed to know. She knew she'd made a mistake. She just didn't want to admit it. "You should apologize," Tom said, his voice calm but firm. Margaret turned sharply, her brow furrowing. "What?" "You heard me," he said, setting the paper down. "You called the police on a family that's done nothing wrong. They live here, Margaret. They're our neighbors. You need to make this right." Margaret scoffed, though the sound lacked conviction. "I was just being cautious. You know how things are these days." Tom's gaze didn't waver. "I know how things are because people make them that way. You've got a chance to do better. Don't waste it." Margaret didn't respond. She turned back to her plant, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the soil. Deep down, she knew he was right, but the thought of facing the police chief, the man she had essentially accused of not belonging, filled her with dread. Meanwhile, Jamal's frustration was growing. After school, he took his basketball and headed to the driveway, determined to reclaim the space that had been taken from him. He dribbled the ball with purpose, the rhythmic thud echoing down the street. His younger siblings joined him after a while, their laughter hesitant but genuine as they tried to shake off the unease of the past day. From her porch, Margaret watched them. She wanted to look away, to retreat inside and pretend none of this was her problem. But something about Jamal's determined face held her gaze. He wasn't just playing basketball. He was making a statement. And in that moment, she realized just how wrong she had been. But Margaret wasn't the only one watching. Across the street, another neighbor, a woman named Carla, stood at her mailbox, her expression thoughtful. Carla had lived in the neighborhood for years, and she had seen Margaret's antics before. But this time, it felt different. She walked over to the chief's house, hesitating for a moment before ringing the doorbell. The chief answered, his expression cautious but polite. "Can I help you?" "I just wanted to say," Carla began, her voice quiet, "that what happened yesterday wasn't right. I know Margaret can be difficult, but not all of us feel the way she does. If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know." The chief nodded, a small smile breaking through his serious demeanor. "I appreciate that," he said. "It means a lot." Carla glanced at the kids playing in the driveway, her heart aching for them. "They seem like great kids," she said. "I'm sorry they had to go through that." "They are great kids," the chief replied, his voice steady. "And they'll be okay, but thank you." As Carla walked away, Margaret watched from her porch, her jaw tightening. She could feel the tide turning, and it unsettled her. For years, she had been the unchallenged voice of the neighborhood, the one people turned to for advice and complaints. But now, her authority felt shaky, and for the first time, she wondered if her actions had done more harm than good. That evening, the chief sat down with his kids, his tone serious but gentle. "I want you all to know," he said, looking each of them in the eye, "that what happened yesterday wasn't your fault. People make assumptions sometimes, and those assumptions can hurt. But that doesn't mean you stop being who you are." Jamal nodded, his face thoughtful. "I just don't get it, Dad. Why would someone think we don't belong here?" The chief sighed, his heart heavy. "Because they don't know us. And sometimes, when people don't understand something, they react out of fear or ignorance. But that's not on you. It's on them." Mia spoke up, her voice small. "Are they going to call the police on us again?" "No," the chief said firmly. "I'll make sure of that." But as he spoke those words, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The neighborhood was quiet for now, but the undercurrents of tension remained. There were still questions to be answered, conversations to be had, and bridges to be built or burned. The next day, the air in the neighborhood felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. Margaret paced her living room, unable to shake the growing unease. Her husband's words lingered in her mind, and for once, she wasn't sure if her usual justifications could hold up. She peeked out the window again, watching the family at the end of the cul-de-sac. The kids were back outside, playing basketball in the driveway. Their laughter was soft at first, but as they grew more comfortable, it began to rise and echo through the street. It was just laughter, ordinary, joyful, but it clawed at Margaret's composure. She knew it wasn't the sound of trouble. It was the sound of something she had stolen from them, even if only for a moment. And now, the cracks in her resolve were beginning to show. Across the street, Jamal felt those cracks too, though he couldn't name them. His gaze kept darting to Margaret's house, where her silhouette hovered behind the curtain like a ghost. She didn't say anything, didn't come outside, but her presence felt louder than her words ever could. Jamal focused harder on the ball, dribbling faster, trying to drown out the confusion in his head. He wanted to forget her, to forget the way the flashing lights had felt like judgment, like they had been caught doing something wrong when all they'd been doing was living. Inside the house, the chief was on a call with his precinct, his tone calm but firm. The officer who had arrived that day had filed a report, one that painted Margaret's actions in a less than flattering light. "We can't let this slide," the chief said, his voice steady but sharp. "If we do, it sets a precedent. People need to know that these kinds of calls aren't just a nuisance. They are harmful. They waste resources and traumatize people." The officer on the other end hesitated. "Are you sure you want to escalate this, Chief?" "Well, you know how these things play out in small towns." "I do," the chief replied, his tone unwavering. "But that's exactly why we have to address it. I'm not looking for revenge. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen again, to my family or anyone else's." As the day wore on, the tension in the neighborhood seemed to build. A few neighbors had noticed the increased presence of the chief's family, the way they carried themselves with quiet dignity despite the situation. Whispers started to circulate, some sympathetic, others defensive. Carla, the neighbor who had reached out earlier, decided to take matters into her own hands. She knocked on Margaret's door just before sunset, her expression firm, but not unkind. Margaret opened the door, surprised to see her standing there. Carla didn't waste time. "We need to talk." Margaret frowned, crossing her arms. "About what?" "About what you did," Carla said, her voice steady. "Calling the police on those kids. That wasn't right, Margaret. You know it wasn't." "I was just being cautious." Margaret shot back, though her voice wavered. "You never know these days." "Cautious?" Carla repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Cautious is asking questions. Cautious is introducing yourself and getting to know your neighbors. What you did wasn't cautious. It was cruel. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Carla pressed on, her tone softening just slightly. Do you even know them? Do you know anything about that family? Because I do. I've talked to them. They're good people, Margaret. They don't deserve this. Margaret's face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and defensiveness. I didn't mean to cause trouble, she muttered. I thought it was better to be safe. Safe, Carla said, her voice sharp now. Safe for who? For you. Because it certainly wasn't safe for those kids, Margaret. Do you know what it's like to have the police show up at your door for no reason? Do you understand what that does to a child? Margaret couldn't respond. She looked down at her hands, her knuckles white from gripping the doorframe. Carla sighed, shaking her head. You need to fix this, she said finally. And soon. Because if you don't, it's not just them you'll have to answer to. It's all of us. As Carla walked away, Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her thoughts a swirling mess of guilt and indignation. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just facing the chief, she was facing the entire neighborhood, and that thought terrified her. Back at the chief's house, dinner was quieter than usual. The kids ate in silence, their earlier laughter replaced by a sense of unease. The chief and his wife exchanged a glance, their unspoken worries hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Jamal broke the silence. Are we ever going to feel normal here? He asked, his voice quiet but firm. Because right now, it doesn't feel like home. His father looked at him, his heart aching at the weight in his son's voice. It will, he said softly. But sometimes making a place feel like home takes work, and it takes time. We can't control how other people see us, Jamal, but we can control how we respond to it. Jamal nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. His dad's words were always strong, always steady, but part of him wondered if even the chief's confidence had limits. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the neighborhood in a deep, dusky glow. Margaret sat on her porch, staring at the street. The kids were gone now, their laughter replaced by the quiet hum of crickets. She felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. The call she'd made, the faces of the kids when the police arrived, the chief's steady gaze as he stood in her line of sight. She thought about Tom's words, about Carla's confrontation, about everything she'd been trying to ignore. And for the first time, she wondered if her actions had done more than just ruffle feathers. Maybe they had revealed something deeper, something about herself that she wasn't ready to face. The neighborhood settled into an uneasy quiet, each house holding its own worries and whispers. But in the stillness, a storm was brewing, a confrontation that none of them could avoid. The chief wasn't going to let this go. Margaret wasn't sure how to make amends, and the rest of the neighbors were watching, waiting to see how it all would unfold. The quiet of the evening was interrupted by a knock at the chief's door. It was deliberate but not urgent, the kind of knock that carried curiosity rather than distress. The chief opened it to find Carla standing on the porch again, her arms crossed and her face unreadable. He raised an eyebrow, stepping aside to let her in. I didn't mean to bother you this late, she began, glancing nervously at the family gathered in the living room. But there's something you should know. The chief's jaw tightened. He could sense the weight of her words before she even said them. Go on, he urged, his voice calm but firm. Carla hesitated, then took a deep breath. Margaret wasn't acting alone, she said finally. She's been stirring things up with a few of the other neighbors. I didn't think much of it at first, just her usual gossip. But now I'm starting to wonder if there's more to it. She's been telling people that your family doesn't fit in here. That you're not like the rest of us. The room went silent. Jamal's grip on his glass tightened, his knuckles white. His younger siblings exchanged worried glances, their unease palpable. The chief's wife placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, but even she looked troubled. Do you have any idea who else she's been talking to? The chief asked, his tone measured but edged with steel. Carla nodded, her expression grim. I've heard her talking to the Thompsons next door and a few others down the street. They're not outright saying anything, but you can tell they're listening. I just thought you should know. If she's got people on her side, this might not stop with one call. The chief thanked her, his voice steady but distant. As Carla left, the weight of her words settled over the family like a storm cloud. Margaret wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was trying to turn the neighborhood against them, to make them feel like outsiders in their own home. And now it wasn't just about one family, it was about a community being tested. The next day, the chief decided it was time to act. He wasn't one to confront people without cause, but this wasn't just about his family anymore. It was about setting an example, about showing his kids and the rest of the neighborhood that fear and prejudice couldn't go unchecked. He put on his uniform, the badge gleaming on his chest, and walked down the street toward Margaret's house. Margaret saw him coming through the window, her stomach twisting. She had been avoiding him, hoping the tension would blow over, but now there was no escape. She opened the door reluctantly, her face pale and tight. "Chief," she said, her voice strained. "What brings you here?" He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need to talk," he said firmly, "about the call you made, and about the things you've been saying to our neighbors." Margaret's eyes darted to the street, as if hoping someone might come to her rescue. But the street was quiet, the other houses still. It was just the two of them, and the weight of everything unsaid. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice wavering. "Yes, you do," the chief replied, his tone calm but unyielding. "You've been spreading rumors, Margaret. You've been trying to make people question whether my family belongs here. And I want to know why." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Her defenses, so carefully built, seemed to crumble under his steady gaze. She looked away, her face flushed with guilt. "I didn't mean any harm," she muttered finally. I just thought people should be aware. You're new here, and people don't always adjust well to change." "Change," the chief repeated, his voice sharp. "My family moving into this neighborhood isn't change, Margaret. It's life, it's progress, and it's not something you get to decide." Margaret flinched at his words, but before she could respond, another voice broke the tension. "Is everything okay here?" They both turned to see Tom standing in the doorway, his face a mix of concern and frustration. He had overheard the conversation and decided it was time to intervene. "Tom," Margaret began, her voice pleading. "I was just explaining." "No," Tom interrupted, his tone firm. "You've done enough explaining, Margaret. It's time to listen." Margaret stared at him, stunned into silence. Tom turned to the chief, his expression earnest. "I'm sorry for what my wife has done," he said. "She was wrong, and I won't defend it. You and your family have every right to be here, just like the rest of us." The chief nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I appreciate that," he said. "But this isn't just about an apology. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." Tom nodded, his face grim. "I understand, and I'll make sure of it." As the chief walked away, Margaret's mind raced. She had been caught off guard, exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. But even as guilt gnawed at her, a new emotion began to take root: resentment. She wasn't used to being challenged, to being told she was wrong. And now, with her husband taking the chief's side, she felt more isolated than ever. Back at the house, the chief sat down with his wife, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think this is over," he said quietly. "Margaret might back off for now, but if she's got other people on her side, this could escalate." His wife nodded, her face serious. "So what do we do?" "We stay vigilant," he replied. "And we show this neighborhood who we are, not just through words, but through actions. We're not going anywhere, and we're not backing down." But even as he spoke those words, a sense of unease settled in his chest. Margaret's resentment wasn't just personal. It was a symbol of something larger, something that wouldn't be resolved with a single conversation. And as the neighborhood watched from behind drawn curtains, the question hung heavy in the air. How far would Margaret, and those who supported her, be willing to go? The following week, the neighborhood felt like a powder keg, ready to ignite at the slightest spark. People were talking, at the grocery store, on the sidewalks, even in hushed tones at the local diner. Some sided with the chief, praising his calm but firm approach. Others whispered that Margaret had a point, couching their prejudice in phrases like neighborhood standards and preserving the community. It was clear the tension wasn't just between two households anymore. It had spread, dividing the neighborhood in ways no one had foreseen. The chief decided to host a neighborhood barbecue that weekend. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a simple invitation to everyone on the block to come by, share a meal, and get to know one another. His wife suggested it as a way to bridge the growing divide, and he agreed, though he knew it was a gamble. Some people might not show up. Others might see it as a challenge rather than an olive branch, but it was worth trying. On the day of the barbecue, the smell of grilled burgers and chicken wafted through the air, mingling with the laughter of children playing in the yard. Gilmore and his siblings had invited a few friends from school, and their energy was infectious, drawing smiles even from the initially hesitant guests. Slowly, neighbors began to arrive, some bringing side dishes, others just their curiosity. Carla and her husband were among the first, followed by the Thompsons, who, to everyone's surprise, brought a plate of cookies. Margaret, however, stayed inside her house, peeking through the curtains as the scene unfolded. Tom tried to convince her to come, but she refused, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I'm not going to pretend everything's fine," she said. "They're just trying to make us look like the bad guys." "Maybe because we are, Margaret," Tom replied, his voice tinged with frustration. "This isn't about sides anymore. It's about being decent. You can't keep holding on to this grudge." But Margaret wouldn't budge. As the hours passed and the barbecue showed no signs of winding down, her resentment grew. She felt like she was losing something, though she couldn't quite name what it was. Her neighborhood, a sense of control, her certainty. It all felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Meanwhile, at the barbecue, the chief was making his rounds, chatting with neighbors, sharing laughs, and quietly diffusing lingering tensions. He knew the importance of showing his humanity, of reminding people that he and his family were just like them. For a while, it seemed to be working. People were relaxing, enjoying themselves, and even starting to mingle with those they had previously avoided. Just as the sun began to set, casting the yard in a warm orange glow, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. The sight of it sent a ripple through the crowd, conversations halting as everyone turned to look. The chief's heart sank. For a moment, he thought it was another baseless call, but then he recognized the officer stepping out of the car. It was one of his own. The officer approached, his expression serious but not hostile. "Chief," he said, nodding respectfully, "I hate to interrupt, but we've had a report of a possible disturbance in the area." The chief's jaw tightened. He didn't need to ask who had made the call. He turned to the crowd, offering an apologetic smile. "Excuse me for a moment," he said, leading the officer to the side. The conversation was brief, and when the officer left, the chief decided it was time to address the elephant in the room. He stepped onto the small wooden deck, raising his voice just enough to be heard over the murmurs. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone calm but firm, "I want to thank you all for coming today. This barbecue was meant to bring us together, to remind us that we're neighbors before anything else, but it seems not everyone shares that sentiment." He didn't name Margaret, but everyone knew who he meant. "Let me be clear," he continued. "My family and I are here to stay. We're not here to change your way of life or take anything from you. We're here to live, just like you. And I hope in time, we can all see each other for who we really are, not as strangers, but as people." The crowd was silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling over them. Then, one by one, people began to clap. It started hesitantly, but it grew, swelling into a genuine show of support. Margaret watched from her window, her face a mixture of anger and something else, something like regret. The barbecue continued late into the evening, the atmosphere lighter now, as if a collective exhale had passed through the crowd. But just when it seemed like the night would end on a high note, there was a knock at the chief's door. He opened it to find Margaret standing there, her expression guarded but not hostile. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice quiet. The chief stepped aside, letting her in. The room fell silent as the neighbors watched her enter, their curiosity palpable. Margaret looked around, her discomfort evident. She cleared her throat, then turned to the chief. "Hired on to apologize," she began, her voice shaky. "For the call, for the things I said. I was wrong." The chief nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said simply. Margaret hesitated, then added, "But there's something else, something you should know." The room tensed, the air thick with anticipation. Margaret took a deep breath, then said, "I wasn't the only one making those calls. Someone else has been stirring things up, trying to cause trouble for your family. And I think they're planning something worse." The chief's expression darkened. "Who?" Margaret hesitated, glancing nervously at the faces around her. "I don't know for sure," she admitted. "But I've heard things. People talking about making it clear that you're not welcome here." The room buzzed with low murmurs, the weight of her words sinking in. The chief nodded, his jaw tight. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "But if anyone thinks they can intimidate my family, they're going to find out just how wrong they are." The night ended on an uneasy note, the revelation hanging over the neighborhood like a storm cloud. The chief knew this wasn't over, but as he looked around at the faces of his neighbors, some supportive, some conflicted, but all watching him with a newfound respect, he felt a flicker of hope. Whatever came next, he was ready for it. And this time, he wouldn't be standing alone. The following days were tense but illuminating. Margaret's confession had set off a ripple effect across the neighborhood, forcing people to confront not only their opinions about the chief and his family, but also the quiet prejudices that had lingered beneath the surface for years. Conversations began to unfold in unexpected places, at the park, in grocery store aisles, and over back fences. Some neighbors admitted to feeling uncomfortable with the changes in the community, while others openly rejected the idea that anyone could dictate who belonged and who didn't. Slowly but surely, the true character of the neighborhood began to reveal itself. The chief stayed vigilant but refused to let fear dictate his actions. He continued his routine of morning jogs with Jamal, chats with neighbors, and school events with his younger kids. His family remained visible and unapologetically present, sending a clear message: they weren't going anywhere. Margaret, too, found herself at a crossroads. Her apology had been sincere, but it hadn't erased the tension or mistrust she had sown. Many of her neighbors now viewed her with suspicion, while others avoided her entirely. Even Tom, who had always been patient, seemed distant, spending more time away from the house than usual. She felt isolated in a way she hadn't anticipated, and for the first time, she began to question not just her actions, but the beliefs that had led her there. One evening, she found herself standing on the edge of the park, watching Jamal and his siblings play basketball with some of the other neighborhood kids. They were laughing, their joy infectious, and Margaret felt a pang of regret she couldn't quite shake. Meanwhile, the chief decided to investigate Margaret's warning. He discreetly reached out to his department, requesting additional patrols in the area and keeping an eye on any unusual activity. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but he knew that vigilance was key. His wife, ever pragmatic, suggested they also document any incidents, no matter how small. "Better to have a record," she said, her voice calm but firm, "just in case." One evening, as the family was sitting down to dinner, there was a knock at the door. This time, it was Carla again, her face flushed with urgency. "Chief," she said, her voice low, "you need to see this." She led him down the street to the park, where someone had spray-painted hateful graffiti on the side of the basketball court. The words were ugly, meant to intimidate, but they only fueled the chief's resolve. He called it in immediately, and within the hour, officers were on the scene, documenting the vandalism and talking to neighbors. The incident rattled the community, but it also sparked a wave of support for the chief and his family. Several neighbors volunteered to help clean up the graffiti, and by the next morning, the court was spotless, the hateful words erased by unity and determination. In the weeks that followed, the chief worked tirelessly to rebuild trust and strengthen the community. He organized a series of town hall meetings, inviting neighbors to come together and discuss their concerns openly. The meetings weren't always easy, emotions ran high, and old wounds were uncovered, but they were necessary. Slowly, conversations shifted from blame and fear to understanding and compromise. Margaret attended one of the meetings, sitting quietly in the back. She didn't speak, but she listened, her face a mixture of shame and something else, something like hope. After the meeting ended, she approached the chief, her hands trembling slightly. "I wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for not giving up on this neighborhood, on us." The chief looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "It's never too late to change, Margaret," he said. "But it starts with actions, not just words." Margaret nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I'll do better," she promised. True to her word, Margaret began to make amends. She joined the neighborhood watch, volunteered at local events, and even reached out to the chief's wife, offering to help with a community garden project she had been organizing. It wasn't an overnight transformation, and not everyone was quick to forgive, but Margaret was determined to prove she was more than her mistakes. Jimmel, too, found his own way to heal. He started inviting some of his classmates to play basketball at the park, building friendships that transcended the neighborhood's divisions. His natural charisma and kindness won over even the most skeptical kids, and soon the court became a symbol of unity rather than discord. As the months passed, the neighborhood began to feel like a true community again. The chief's barbecue became an annual tradition, drawing more people each year. The graffiti incident was never repeated, and the increased patrols quietly reassured those who still felt uneasy. Carla and her husband became close friends with the chief's family, often stopping by for coffee or a chat. Even the Thompsons, once wary, now waved warmly whenever they passed by. One day, as the chief was returning from a jog, he saw Margaret planting flowers in her front yard. She looked up and smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "Morning, Chief," she called out. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "It is," he replied, nodding. "How's the garden coming along?" "Slowly but surely," she said with a chuckle, "but I'll get there." The chief smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but the neighborhood had come a long way. It wasn't perfect. No place ever was, but it was home. And for the first time, it truly felt like one. As he walked up his driveway, he saw Jamal playing catch with his younger siblings, their laughter echoing across the yard. His wife stepped onto the porch, a mug of coffee in her hand, and smiled at him. The chief paused, taking it all in, the warmth of the sun, the sound of his children's laughter, the sense of community that had emerged from the struggle. It wasn't just a victory for his family. It was a victory for everyone who had chosen to stand together. In the end, the story wasn't about one family or one neighbor. It was about the power of resilience, the courage to confront prejudice, and the strength that comes from unity. It was a reminder that change is possible, even in the face of fear and division, and that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most meaningful victories. And as the chief stood there, Surrounded by the life he and his family had built, he knew they were exactly where they were meant to be.